I think there's general unanimity on all sides that the key issue facing the country in this election campaign is the economy. I think people think it's the key issue that's facing and the key matter that's facing mankind, that we have to straighten out the economy. However, I don't think there's any unanimity or agreement or even knowledge about what we mean by economy. The term is thrown around all the time, and people speak about it as if they know what they're talking about. But it's like two people speaking two different languages anytime two people get together and start talking about the economy. What is the economy? And additionally, what do we mean by economics? So I think we have to clear that up. And we can do that by at least giving a summary view of the idea of economy and economics that was developed by Lyndon LaRouche over his lifetime. And this constitutes, in my view, the basic conception of economy and economics, which we as citizens really have to think about when we use the term and when we think about it. And what we have to insist that our politicians and fellow citizens must think about. And this is going to take some work because what most people do when they start talking about economics or even thinking about economics, they get into a very lazy state of mind. And we need to think about this on a much higher level. So this is going to be a bit challenging, and we're not going to solve it in this short presentation, but we are going to be able to begin the discussion. And I can refer you to a series of classes which are up on the Promethean Action website that Tony and I did in collaboration with using a 40-year-old economics class video that LaRouche did and produced in the 1980s, and some other presentations that we've done, and also some presentations we will be doing in the future. So there's a lot to dig into this, and I intend this presentation basically to be a teaser more than a conclusion. But I think it'll be a sufficient enough teaser that it will tease you to want to pursue this effort and give you at least enough grounding that you can demand, to put it in colloquial language, that our politicians and our fellow citizens stop bullshitting when they talk about economics. So what do we mean by economy and economics? Well, Tony in his introduction sort of summed it up, that economy is nothing less than the understanding of human development. What is it? What does human beings do? And the relationship between man and nature. What are we put on this earth to do? And what is that relationship and how does it work? And how do we increase man's power in and over nature? Now, LaRouche identified this many times in his economics work, but especially in this Power of Labor class series that we reproduced on our Promethean Action website, by identifying the biblical injunction from Genesis, be fruitful and multiply and subdue nature. And that's what economy is. And economics is the science of discovering that. And as LaRouche pointed out, that means that economics and the study of economy is the king of all sciences. It subsumes everything. It's not what people think. It's the study and mastery and improvement of man's understanding of man, man's understanding of nature, and man's ability to act both on his own capabilities and also on nature itself. And this expresses itself in human history by the fact that the human race is the only species which has increased its population and its capability from one generation to another. We can document this very clearly by looking at just the simple rate of growth of the human population from the earliest records to the present. And you see basically an increase, constantly increasing growth of human population and exponential growth beginning around the time of the European Renaissance. And this progress of human development is characterized by an increase, as I mentioned, in man's power in and over nature. Unlike any other species, the human race, human beings change their relationship to the world around them. Stated very simply, cows eat grass, and they've eaten grass and ruminated on it for millennia, for their entire existence, since the species of cows came into existence, putting aside the question of how they came into existence and what that means. But they can't grow grass. When there's no grass to be eaten, the cow starves. But man is not like that. Man changes his relationship to nature. And as Susan Kokinda so beautifully put in her presentation this morning, this is exemplified by man's control of fire. We're the only species who, instead of running away from fire, actually masters and harnesses it. And so the first principle of economics that we have to insist on is the idea that we're discussing and concerning ourselves with improving man's condition, increasing man's power in and over nature, human development. That means development both of man's physical conditions and also man's understanding of himself and developing the human mind. That takes us into the area of art and science and philosophy and so forth. Now, this characteristic, as LaRouche pointed out, that we see over the long term can be measured by many different parameters and quantitized, such as an increase in potential relative population density, which is not just an increase in population, but an increase in the density of population that's able to be maintained relative to the existing characteristics of the land by the development of new technology. There are also other things that measure whether or not man's development, economic development is improving or not, such as the parameter of energy flux, which is the amount of energy applied to a given work surface. So, for example, nuclear energy is a much more advanced energy source than solar or wind, which is a very low density energy source. And man, if you look at the history of technology, has survived by increasing his energy flux density from wind power and muscle power to heat powered machines and to electricity, and then also now nuclear and hopefully very soon fusion energy. So that's another parameter we want to look at, the energy flux density. So this kind of parameter provides us with very simple ability to judge that the decisions, for example, to switch to low dense energies like solar and wind, or even the current idea of switching to all electric vehicles and so forth, is not going to work. It's a negative effect on economic development. There are other parameters which require some detailed discussions, which you can hear about by going through those studies in classes that I mentioned. But what LaRouche emphasized, and what is crucial in economics, is that the increase in these parameters, the free energy ratio, the increase in energy flux density, the increase in potential relative population density, all occur by one process, and that is changes and improvements in the creative powers of the human mind. Now, this involves two things. This involves both the changes in man's knowledge of scientific things, and also, as I mentioned, changes in man's knowledge of himself, his understanding of both how the human mind works, but also how society works. And I would include most emphatically in this the great accomplishment of the creation of the United States as a constitutional republic, which is not a political matter, but actually the result of centuries, millennia of effort on the part of mankind to develop the notion and practice of a society which is organized around man's fundamental nature, which is the improvement of the creative powers of the human mind. And I think this is expressed in principle in the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution of the United States, but it's also been expressed in practice by the history of the United States overcoming British imperialism and feudalism and establishing itself as the most progressive economy and society ever in the history of mankind. So these are the kinds of things which are subsumed under the idea of economics. Now, how does this progress occur? Well, LaRouche identified that it occurs, as I mentioned, around the idea of the increase in the creative powers of the human mind. But he didn't just say that in a general term. He meant this in a very specific way. And that is, in expressing this, he referred to some of the work of Plato, the great Greek philosopher, who spoke about the idea of, and this is relevant not only for economics, but it's relevant for what I'm going to speak about in a minute, as Tony mentioned, which is the implications of this for the future of science. And this is the idea that the increase in the creative powers of the human mind and the effectiveness in the application of those creative powers occurs through a process which Plato described as hypothesizing the higher hypothesis. Now, that's a big term. It has a lot of meaning, and you really have to delve into it. It's a lifetime of study, but it's fundamentally can be very simply summarized in the following way, as LaRouche did in this Power of Labor class. What do we mean by hypothesizing the higher hypothesis? Well, what do we mean by a hypothesis? Well, a hypothesis, and this is relevant for the problems in science and the future of science, is best characterized as a set of axiomatic assumptions under which we think about the world. I'll give you a simple example of this is, say, Euclidean geometry, which begins with a simple set of axioms and postulates. A point is that which has no width, depth, or breadth. A line is only breadth, et cetera, et cetera. You go from these axioms and postulates, which are unproven, and then from there you use logical deduction to come to your conclusions. And you prove all the theorems that you may or may not have been exposed to in junior high school and elementary school geometry. Now, the problem is that all things of such a hypothesis are dependent on the truthfulness, that is the reality of these axioms, postulates, and definitions. And as Gauss and Riemann showed, for example, with the case of Euclidean geometry, that the axioms of Euclidean geometry cannot be proven, and they may not be true. There's an unstated assumption that all your geometric constructions are taking place on a flat surface. And if you have a curved surface, then all these theorems are not true, and they fall apart. Well, we see this in physics and in science and in politics and in art and in history and in everything else. There's examples of this. And I'll give you a simple one just to give you a reference point. In the late 1500s, Johannes Kepler, who was an astronomer, revolutionized physics by showing that the way everybody had been thinking about the world for millennia was completely wrong. It had been assumed that because in geometry, the simplest figure was a perfect circle, that the planets and the stars and the universe was all organized according to perfect circles. And without going into detail of this, Kepler showed by great rigor and experimental evidence that this was not true, that the planets in particular, and actually all other motion in the universe, was non-constant. The planets were moving in elliptic type orbits. That is, they were always changing. They were always doing something different than they were just done, and they were about to do something different than they were doing now. And the implication of this was not just for astronomy, but for man's knowledge of the universe and his relationship to science altogether, and his understanding of his relationship to God. That the universe, according to Kepler, who was inspired by a great philosopher, Nicholas of Cusa, and I believe we have some books there for sale which have some translations of Cusa's work, that the universe is not a fixed thing. God did not create a fixed universe. He created one which is not perfect in the sense of fixed, but perfect in the sense of self-perfectibility. And that this was reflected in the actual physical universe itself, that it was always changing. And that science had to stop looking for fixed ideas and start looking for how do things change? What is the principle of change? So this is an example of a shift in hypothesis, away from the underlying hypothesis based on certain underlying assumptions into a completely different understanding. And that LaRouche would refer to as a higher hypothesis. But then there's something even more important, even higher. And that is the fact that we can sit around right now, and Kepler discussed it himself, and talk about this process and think about this process, about how the mind made that change from a world that seemed to be fixed in a certain way to something that was completely different. And that process, the process of reflecting on how the mind itself changes, is called the hypothesis of the higher hypothesis. Now, this is not just a philosophical question, but this is the very essence of how the universe progresses. This is the very essence of how mankind progresses, but it's also the very essence of how the whole universe progresses. I thought Tony put it very poetically and right that God put man in the universe to discover his creation and to participate in the creation. And I think that's a view that's held by all people who reflect deeply on this question, on these kinds of questions. So this is what we're talking about when we speak of economy and economics, what we have to concern ourselves with. Now, this involves another principle which has to be kept in mind, which is that when we're dealing with economy and economics on this level, there are basically three time elements. There's the short term, the medium term, and the long term. The short term draws our attention most of the time because it involves immediate survival. And so we think a lot about short-term problems, and these are emergencies which have to be solved. But it's also a way that we get fooled because the politicians and the oligarchs always want to give us a false choice based on a short-term problem, when in fact the short-term problems are a result of long-term changes. And you have to be thinking about what are the long-term shifts that actually determine the crisis or the problems that you're facing today. So, for example, as Tony mentioned, for the last 100 years, we've had a crisis in science because there haven't really been any fundamental new breakthroughs in theoretical science and the breakthroughs in higher hypotheses. And in fact, we had a revolution at the end of the 19th century, which opened up a whole series of new ideas about the nature of the universe, which caused us to question some of the basic assumptions of science. And we've been able to harness those things with new developments in technology and increases in energy flux density and so forth, nuclear power, the spaceship that just went up, lasers, new breakthroughs in medicine and biology, and so forth. But yet our basic understanding has been stifled because of a lack of focus on a higher hypothesis that, like Kepler's discovery of the elliptical orbits, gets us into a deeper understanding of the nature of man and the universe. And so we have to insist, both in our own minds and in our own discussions, that we focus on these long-term ideas. And that also guides us in the short term. For example, as I mentioned, that shows us why it's absolutely insane to base our economic decisions and our economic policies on such idiotic ideas like climate change, like decreasing energy flux density, shifting to wind and solar power, or this latest regulation, which I'm sure has caught the attention of everybody in Michigan, that Biden came out with just yesterday to mandate that by 2031, all internal combustion engines have to have a mileage of 65 miles to the gallon. These kinds of crazy ideas. So we know that the short-term implementation of these ideas will have long-term effects. Now, how does this relate to the coming breakthroughs in science? Well, what this means is that science, physical science, and biological science, when I talk about physical sciences, I'm talking about, in addition to biological and sciences, has to reject, like Kepler did, the practices of science that keep us fixed in a axiomatic system known as reductionism. And basically the way reductionism approaches is what you've learned in school and what dominates most people's thinking, that man makes progress in science and understanding of the universe by being able to create new mathematical structures, mathematical equations and mathematical descriptions. And now it's been extended with the development of computer technology to computational systems that mimic what we think the physical universe or the biological world is doing. And as a result, science has been hampered by its inability to actually understand the basic concepts of the physical universe. And the more we apply this failed method of reductionism, the less we know. For example, you take the understanding of life. Pretty much for the last 100 years, most of the work in the area of life sciences has been dedicated to trying to understand living processes as a result of non-living chemistry. That is, we keep examining chemical reactions and other physical processes and try and discern out of this how life works. And yet, we can't find anything, there's been no progress in that way. Another example is all the effort, for example, in neurophysiology right now, it's been happening, especially with the increase in diagnostic technologies and so forth, to try and find a physical substrate in the brain that can account for human thought, as if human thought is an epiphenomenon of simply the biochemical and electrochemical interactions inside the brain. This is backwards. And to make it even worse, now you have, based on this recent craze of so-called artificial intelligence, which isn't artificial and is not intelligent, that we take the structure of a machine that man makes to do computations and then say, because we've invented this machine that can do these computations, this machine must be a model of how our mind works, when the machine itself couldn't be further in characteristic from the human mind itself. I'm not saying I know what the human mind characteristics are. I know we don't know. And we saw this wonderful video that Susan presented to us this morning of President Trump talking about the Webb telescope and the Hubble telescope. And he ended the question, what is it that is out there? And what do we know so little about life? So what the LaRouche idea of economics gives us the ability to do is to reverse the approach towards science that we've been stuck in for all these last 50, 100 years or so, and start to take an approach like Kepler. Start from the standpoint of not looking at how do abiotic chemicals produce life and start and invert that. How does life control the behavior of abiotic processes? What does life do that non-life doesn't do? Instead of trying to think about how a machine or some non-living chemical process can produce thought, a great work of art, or a new discovery of science, why don't we think about how do ideas come into existence? How does creativity work? How does the mind change the way biology works? Now, we can turn in this regard, just very briefly, to the great Russian scientist Vladimir Vernadsky, who LaRouche emphasized quite a bit, who talked about how there are basically three phases to the universe, and especially on Earth. And those are, the lowest level is the inorganic domain. The second level is life. And the third level is what Vernadsky called the noospheres, the domain of cognition. These don't exist separately from each other, but they interact. And if you think about it, there's a great irony, which is quite instructive in this interaction. The inorganic matter are very energetic. Earthquakes, tsunamis, very powerful energetic forces. Life, compared to inorganic forces, is very weak. Living organisms have very low energy throughput relative to a volcano, for example. And yet, over millennia, over time, the living processes conquer the non-living. They turn rocks into soil. They overtake the non-living. They reorganize the concentration of elements in the non-living parts of the earth and concentrate them into substances that can be harnessed by man. And then you take the next level, which is even weaker than life itself, which is a thought, which is human cognition, which is ideas. What is the energy throughput of a thought? And yet over time, man, through thoughts, changes both life and non-life. And LaRouche added to this a fourth domain, which he called the domain of physical economy. And this is the domain of man's interaction as a species among itself over time, which acts on the individual, creates the thoughts as an interaction between the individual mind and the development of mankind as a whole, and that process mastering life and mastering non-life. There's tremendous implications from what I just said and guidance we can take by delving deep into this concept to understand many of the frontier areas of science, which we don't have time to go into today. So I will end by saying that we should paraphrase the famous aphorism by James Carville, that it's the economy, so don't be stupid.
Thanks for watching. Please take a moment and subscribe to our free newsletter at prometheanaction.com.